Hi everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I'd like to present a Photoshop tutorial on the how and the why of applying textures to your images. Using textures can be a really great technique to add a little extra interest to your photos. So let's jump right in and get started. So as I mentioned, let's first talk about why one might want to add a texture to a photograph. So this particular photo was of a rain chain that I took in a Japanese garden that I was invited to photograph at. And the reason I took it was because I sort of feel like it expressed the sense of Zen that was trying to be transmitted by the garden. Now, the rain chain was in front of a pretty bland off-white stucco wall, and so I knew that it was going to be, as it stood, a bland-looking photograph, although I really liked the subject. And so I knew that once I had processed it, I was going to need to do something to sort of make it more interesting, really. And I suspected that that something was going to be to add a texture. Now, adding textures can also be, for example, very helpful in landscape photos where you have big open areas without detail, like a gray sky. Sometimes it can be useful and even in portraiture in terms of making a more interesting background. You remove the texture from the subject's face. There's lots of types of photography, and I urge experimentation, but there's lots of types of photography that textures can be very useful with. But I just chose this one for today because it really, was very straightforward with one subject. And so with the addition of textures, I was able to transform this photograph into this one, which I think is really a lot more interesting looking. So let's go through exactly how I dealt with the textures, what you can do with the textures once you add them, and really see how you can use these to your advantage. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to close out this final image here. And what I have here is the starting image you can see here with the base layer. And all the layers above it are the ones that I had added in order to achieve the final result. And this is a copy without all those layers. And what I'm going to do is go through step by step building this into this and turn on each layer here as we add it so you can see where we're going with it. So let's get started. As you can see here, the first step is to bring in our first texture. So let's see how we do that. I'm going to go over to Lightroom Classic where I store my images. And here we see an image of another stucco wall in the same garden. And I took that particular photo because I like the image, I like the texture, and I thought it would be fun to bring in a texture from the very same location. So let's open this up in Photoshop. And I am going to edit this in Photoshop and open it as a smart object because that will give me the best results really when I resize the texture to fit the photo. So let's go ahead and open it as a smart object in Photoshop. And here we have the texture. So the question is, how do we move this texture over to this image that we want to apply it to? I'm going to show you two ways to do it for starters. So the way I usually do it is to just highlight that layer, left click with the mouse, and drag it over and hold it over the tab that has the image you'd like to apply it to. Hold down the Shift key because that will center it. Bring the texture down, let go of the mouse, and there it is, applied as a separate layer. Another way to do it, and let me just get rid of this layer to show you. Another way to do it would be to have your texture open and go to Edit, Copy, then go to the image you want to apply it to and go Edit, Paste, and again, there's the texture open on its own layer. So here we are, and here's our texture, but you can see that it's all cockeyed. For one thing, we have a vertical photo and a horizontal texture. for another thing, it may not even cover the entire photo, at least in this orientation. And even if we were to flip it, this photo is obviously cropped and the texture is taken full frame. So how do we deal with this? Well, like most things in Photoshop, there's two ways. We're going to have to transform this texture somehow to fit our photo. And so one way is to go to Edit, Free Transform. And then the other way, which I prefer, is to use the keyboard shortcut of Control-T, which I believe on a Mac is Command-T. Now, this big square shows us exactly where our texture is. And you can see one difference between the two methods that I use to bring our texture here. By using the copy and paste method, it's not dropped in centered. So you can see if I was to grab this and move it, there's the texture centered, and that's how it would be if I was holding down the shift and dragging it over. But be that as it may, we have to now change the orientation of this texture. And what I'm going to do is come right here and right click, and we have a dialog, and that dialog will allow us to rotate the texture. So here I'm going to rotate it, say, 90 degrees counterclockwise. So our texture is now rotated. But you can see, because I had cropped this original photo, that the texture is actually larger than the photograph. Now, it may not matter for this, but there are also some textures that have very artistic edges. And so you may well want to fit the texture to your image exactly. Now, in the old Photoshop, if you grab a corner or a side, it would just adjust that one side. In the new Photoshop, it changes all the sides in relation to each other. The way around that is hold down the Shift key. And when we hold down the Shift key, we can change just that one dimension. And we can fit that exactly to our photo. And when we're done fitting it, we simply hit Enter. And now the texture is applied exactly over the entire photograph. But we still have a bit of a problem here, because as you can see, all we can see is the texture and not the photograph. Somehow we have to blend them in. And so we come right over here to our blend modes. And as you hold your cursor over each blend mode, it will show you what the blend will look like. Now, I believe I used multiply. Let's go check. We'll turn this on because this is where we are now. And in fact, I used multiply. And two other things I'd like to point out. Number one is that you don't have to use the texture at full opacity. And secondly, you can apply a layer mask, as I did here, and remove the texture from some of your main subjects. So as you can see here, I remove the texture from some of the bells. Let's go ahead and build it to specification. So I have the multiply blend mode. We're going to decrease the opacity to 65%. Now, how do you get a layer mask? You simply come down here, click on the mask. We have a white mask, which means everything is applied. And now, if you just paint with your paintbrush, if we go to the brush tool by hitting B, and we go to our colors and switch them so that we're painting in black, make sure our mask is highlighted, and by painting black at a low opacity, we can remove some of that texture from the subject. Now, I'm not going to do that during the video. I'm going to do it, bring that mask over, and show you the next step with the mask having been already applied. So I don't think you want to watch me paint. So here we are, and I've painted in that mask, and we're good to go. So let's see what our next step is. Well, there's this layer here, which is what's called a clipping layer, and I'm going to come back to that because that's something I added at the end and we can deal with later. The next step after that is to add in this second texture. So let's see how we do that. I'm going to go to Lightroom, and here's that texture. And what I'm going to do again is to open it as a smart object in Photoshop. I'm going to grab it, I'm going to hold down Shift, I'm going to bring this over to our image, and I'm going to drop it right on holding the Shift key, and it is centered in place. Let me just come over here quickly and close this, and close this texture. So here's our texture. Now you can see that this texture in particular is quite a bit smaller than the image. So let's go and resize it. As you'll remember, there's two ways to do that. My favorite is to use Control T for transform. And we can hold down Shift and pull each side to where it belongs. And again, holding down the Shift key just allows you to adjust one side without keeping everything in ratio. Now, if you didn't like some of these edges, you could actually pull it further to get rid of some of the edges. But for the moment, let's just stay with things the way they are. And when we're done, you either hit Enter, or the other option is to hit the check mark here, and you're good. Now let's see what we did with it in the original. I'm going to turn that layer on. And you can see that this was a bit of an unusual blending mode that I tried, but I seem to like it. Linear burn at 85% with the same layer mask. So let's come back here. Again, by simply running down the different blend modes, you can see what it would look like. That's an interesting one. But here's linear burn. We turned the opacity, I believe I said 85%. And the actuality is that I use the exact same layer mask. And here's another tip, which is that you actually can take a layer mask and reproduce it by holding down the Alt key and dragging it up. Now we have the exact same layer mask. So here we are. Let's take a look. This is where we are here. This is where we are here. There's a slight difference up here, and I believe that's because I didn't like this edge as much. And you know what? We can change that if we want to by simply coming here to the layer, hitting Control T, and we can simply hold Shift and move that texture up a little bit if we don't like the edge. Now we have the mask out of place because we moved the whole layer. There's an easier way to fix that. I'm showing you this because I think as you decide to make changes, errors like this happen, and I'm going to demonstrate how we fix it. So we can simply delete that layer mask, highlight this layer mask, press Alt, and replace it. And there we go. Looks pretty similar. I think I pulled this one higher. I didn't like the edges at all. But again, it's essentially the same. Hard to reproduce it exactly. It's really the same image at this point, except for where I put the edge up here. So our textures are now in place. So let's see what else I did to the image. I'm going to run through these a little quicker now that our textures are in place, because this is more routine Photoshop, except for the clipping mask, which I'm going to come back to. So the first thing I did was to apply a curves adjustment layer. And we can see with that curve, I added a bit of contrast and I moved the whites a bit. And again, off and on, a little more contrast. With the next layer, I thought, comparatively speaking, that this area and this area here was perhaps a little too dark in relation to the rest of the image. So I added a curve to brighten it, and you can see here's the layer mask, and that effect is applied just to those upper two corners. And again, I'll turn it off and on, and I think you can see the brightness change. Next, another curves layer. I wanted to put a little more emphasis on the subject, and you can see based on the layer mask here that I applied this brightening curve only to the center area with some feathering so that it wouldn't be obvious what exactly I did. You can see there's a lot of feathering after I made a selection in the middle and applied that brightness just to the center. Next, another curve. That made a fair amount of difference. This particular curve you can see is a much steeper S curve and adds a good amount of contrast to the image. I thought that perhaps the yellows were a little too saturated, so we moved on to a hue saturation layer. And you can see here with the yellows, I dropped the yellow saturation a little bit. Again, these are pretty fine tuning touches here. Next, a selective color layer. And you can see if I turn that off and on, I removed some of the yellow to make it more of a brown. And I did that with selective color, choosing the yellows, decreasing the amount of yellow, and lightening it a bit by decreasing the black. Then for the final two curves, I wanted to add a little more detail to the cups, the dark areas of the cups. And so you can see here and here, I just made some minor changes with a curve to add a little more detail there. So let's come back for just a moment and talk about this clipping layer. So an adjustment layer that's clipped to another layer lends its effect only to the layer that it's clipped to. Let's see what I mean. I wanted to increase the contrast of one of the textures a bit, so I made this curve, which is an S curve, to increase contrast, and I clipped it to the texture layer so that its effect of increasing contrast would only be applied to the underlying texture. And you can see that here as I turn it on and off. But what would have happened had I not clipped it? Well, that increased contrast would have been applied not only to the texture layer, but to all layers below it, including our base layer with the bells. So to show you that, first I have to explain to you how do you clip and unclip an adjustment layer. And that's really easy. All one needs to do is hold down the Alt key, and that's Option in the Mac, I believe, and hover your cursor between the two layers that you're clipping. And you can see that my cursor has turned into an unclip icon. Now, if I unclip it by left clicking, you can now see that the layer is affecting all layers underneath it, and the contrast in the bells has gotten much greater. I don't like it because now the bells are very dark. So I'm going to clip it back. How do I do that? I hold the Alt key down. I hover my cursor between the layers, and you can see it turns into a little indicator that that layer is going to be clipped. I left click, and when I do that, it makes this little clipping indicator to tell me that this layer is clipped to the layer below it. So now, if I turn that on and off, you can see that the increase in contrast is applied only to the underlying texture, while the bells stay exactly the same and don't take on that dark appearance. Really, it's a really neat thing to be able to do and very, very helpful when you're processing. I thought I would close this tutorial by just showing you a few of my images that I had applied textures to. Well, I do hope you found that tutorial interesting and useful, and that perhaps if using textures in some of your photos when appropriate isn't something that you've already done, that you might go ahead and give it a shot. If you have any questions about the tutorial or about using textures in general, please feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I'll be sure to answer as best I can. I'm Howard, and my channel is about introducing viewers to photographers who inspire, to discussing all sorts of photographic topics, and to enhancing creativity with Photoshop and Lightroom tutorials. And if those subjects sound interesting to you, I do hope that you would support the channel by clicking on that subscribe button below. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.